Ladies and gentlemen, we made it through period one. Let's start a high-level review of period two. Period two is known as organization and reorganization of human societies, and it's dealing with three main topics. It deals with religion and the start of different religions, the building of classical empires, and the emergence of trans-regional trade networks. So we're going to be talking about a lot of different things during this review. I'm not going to discuss everything that is listed on the PowerPoints, but it is your responsibility to make sure that you are taking notes and that you have the proper information. Okay, let's get started. So the first key concept that's discussed during this period is the development and codification of religious and cultural traditions. And some of the reasons that religion or belief systems came about was to help create community bonds and moral and ethical codes to follow. It helped reinforce social stratification, and in some cases, it merged with political rulers to justify their reign. And two examples of this will be the Mandate of Heaven, which we will see in the Chinese dynasties, the early Chinese dynasties, and the beliefs of the pharaohs of the ancient civilizations within Egypt. And both of these believed that they became rulers with the support of gods and the fact that they were almost godlike themselves. Something we always see within the growth of different religions, though, is that differences start to lead to conflict between the religions, and we'll see that throughout world history. Something we need to keep in mind, though, is two religions actually began during the first period time versus this period that we're talking about now, and that is Judaism and Hinduism. So the first religion we want to talk about briefly is Hinduism. Hinduism started in India, and the Vedas was brought by the Indo-Europeans. Now the Vedas is a body of text that originated in ancient India and it is the oldest scriptures of Hinduism. And it was written in Sanskrit, which is the sacred language of Hinduism. There's no specific founder, it's more of a cultural diffusion, and there's belief that there's a supreme soul, by the name of Brahman, and that you go through these different steps to become one with the universe. Hinduism has a very strong caste system, and it is mainly patriarchal, which means male dominated. The next religion we're going to touch on briefly is Buddhism. Buddhism was founded somewhere around 500 BCE by Siddhartha Gautama, who was the Buddha, and it kind of developed from Hinduism. Buddhism believes in Four Noble Truths that deal with suffering and desire, and has this eightfold path that you need to follow for the right life. What I would like you to do is pause this for a moment, and I want you to look up what the Four Noble Truths are and what the Eightfold Path is. And then you can start through the PowerPoint again. Okay, Buddhism also says that everybody is trying to reach nirvana and that it is accessible for everybody. The positive thing about Buddhism is it appealed to everybody. It appealed to the poor because there was an equality amongst the believers and that anybody could reach these Four Noble Truths and follow this eightfold path. Buddhism is one of the religions that seeks converts, so it views itself as being universal, and it continued to spread through Emperor Asaka of the Mauryan Empire because he had converted to Buddhism. It eventually started to spread east, and there are two rules of thought within Buddhism. There is the Theravada, which believes that you can liberate yourself from suffering. So there's a self-enlightenment. And then the second school within it is the Mahayana, which believes that everybody's in it together and that everybody needs each other for liberation. Next, there's Confucianism. Confucianism started in China during the Warring States period. We will talk more about the Warring States period in class, but this was around 500 BCE as well. The founder was Confucius. Confucianism is very relationship oriented. There needs to be a respect for your elders. And there are these 5 key relationships where you have your superior and your inferior. So I would like you to now do a quick research and find out what these 5 key relationships are. So you can pause, then come back. Confucianism is very patriarchal as well. And one of the things that was started during the Han Dynasty that strongly believed in Confucianism was a civil service exam. And the civil service exam basically gave people within different hierarchies in society a chance to move up. You weren't stuck in a particular place. If you took this exam, you could move up and you could move into government type positions. Confucianism truly helped provide social order and stability to China. That's one of the reasons why it came about during these warring states period. The warring states period, very high level, was a constant battle between the different clans or the different groups within China. Confucianism helped create stability during this period, and therefore it was strongly accepted by the Chinese government. Taoism, another religious belief that came about during the Warring States period, was founded by somebody named Lazi, and the main concept of Taoism is harmony with nature. This is where you have your yin and your yang. There's always this balance. And basically, Taoists believe just disengage and be. Just go with the flow. There's a balance. Everything's going to be fine. The real effect that Taoism had on culture dealt more with medicine and poetry, architecture, things like that. Judaism is one of the religions that we mentioned actually started earlier during the years of period 1. It began in the Middle East with the founder of Abraham. Judaism was the first monotheistic religion, which means belief in one God. Judaism believes that they have a covenant or agreement with God, and the Torah is the holy book. Hebrew communities were constantly conquered and chased out of what area they were living in, which led to a diaspora or a scattering of the people. So throughout world history, we see small communities of Jews throughout. Then we have Christianity. Christianity it says here founded by Jesus. In actuality, it was founded by his disciples. It developed from Judaism. One of the things that people really liked about Christianity is there was this equality of believers. It appealed to everybody, rich, poor, men, women. And it was also a monastic life, monotheism, belief in one God. It spread through missionaries, eventually became the main religion within Rome. Even though originally Christians were persecuted by the Romans, it then became an official religion of the Roman Empire around 380 CE under the Emperor Constantine. So this map here is just showing you the spread of both Christianity and Buddhism. Buddhism starting here in India and then spreading out through Asia. And then we have Christianity starting here around the Mediterranean area, and then eventually spreading throughout Europe and northern Africa, and some into Asia as well. Now, besides religion, we also had some other philosophies that were starting to come about during this time. There is this Greco Roman philosophy where we start to think about people like Aristotle and Socrates, where they're starting to question different types of ideas. Here's where we start to see more development of the sciences, Socratic methods, scientific methods, and a different type of reasoning within logic versus a religious belief. When we think of these different religions around the world that developed around the same time, they're all kind of based around this axial age theory. Confucianism, Buddhism, and then Christianity years later, Islam years later. So I want you to take a moment with this, and I want you to look up what axial age theory means. Okay, let's now talk about some of the empires that started to build around this time. And we're going to start with China. And if you remember, we played that song in class, and that song is a way to help you remember the order of the different Chinese empires and Chinese dynasties. So listen to that song every once in a while, and it's really going to help. The first one is the Zhou dynasty. Z-H-O-U is pronounced Zhou. And this is where the whole concept of the mandate of heaven came about. It was the longest running dynasty, and when this dynasty ended, it led into the Warring States period of ancient Chinese history. After the Zhou dynasty, there was the Qin dynasty. Q-I-N is pronounced Qin. It was most likely the shortest dynasty, but one of the most important. And that's because it unified China for the very first time. Now, there was a type of thought process or the way they ran their government called legalism, which was extremely harsh but effective. And it helped create this centralized government. So I would like you to look up the term legalism in reference to the Qin dynasty. And you should have already read this in your textbook, so it should be pretty straightforward. The building of the Great Wall of China started with the Qin dynasty. And another thing that's pretty famous from this dynasty is the tomb of the terracotta warriors. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, this is an example. They had unearthed a tomb. Within that tomb, they found all of these statues of warriors. Basically, the emperor is being escorted to heaven by his army. So after the Qin dynasty, we have the Han dynasty. The Han dynasty was known as the Golden Age for China. It was probably one of the more peaceful and stable dynasties. Confucianism was followed to an extent, which helped create the social mobility because of the civil service exam. And within the Han dynasty, that's where we see the beginning of the Silk Road. And what the Silk Road did was help link China to the rest of Europe. Again, this dynasty was very patriarchy in beliefs where men were looked upon to have a little bit more power than women. And some of the big achievements during this time was coined money, paper, and most important, the compass. So let's move on to India. India was usually politically decentralized. So having an empire was not the norm within India. There were a couple of cities that we talk about. The first one is Mauryan. The founder united a subcontinent by two earlier empires, kind of brought them together. He was his grandson, Ashoka, converted to Buddhism, which helped spread Buddhism through India. The second city was Gupta. Gupta was known as the Golden Age, and Hinduism was very popular during this particular time. We also have some Mediterranean empires, which you guys should be reading about in your textbook. This is where we have the Persian empires come about, which is now present day Iran. The religion during this time in the Persian Empire was the Zoroastrianism, which was very religiously tolerant. The Persian empires had a very strong military, and one of the things that they used to help rule their empire were regional leaders known as satraps. Eventually, Persia is conquered by Alexander the Great and becomes part of his empire. Two other Mediterranean empires was Parthian and the Sassanids. The Sassanids were the last pre-Islamic Persian empire. So they were the last empire within Persia, within the Mediterranean area, that was not predominantly Islam. Now, we also have Greece. Ancient Greece was most known for having city-states, so they were not unified. They had separate city-states that ruled differently. So an example is Athens, which was very democratic and deep in philosophy and arts, versus Sparta, which was more totalitarian and very military-based. The one thing, these city-states would come together to defeat a common enemy. So at one point they all came together to defeat Persia. And one of the famous wars internally, where you had city-states fighting against themselves, was the Peloponnesian War. And that's where Athens fought against Sparta. Eventually, all these wars, these internal wars, weaken Greece, and they make way for Philip II of Macedon to come in and take them over. Now, after the fall of Greece, time becomes known as a Hellenistic Empire. And this is when Philip II's son, Alexander the Great, takes over. Eventually, Alexander built his empire to include Greece, Egypt, Persia, northern India, and it's known as the Golden Age. Alexander had done a lot of traveling, and there were a lot of things he saw around the world that he wanted to bring back to his empire. And so he did that. He built libraries, he built cities and named them after himself, such as Alexandria, that's in Egypt. He would also try and bring religions and languages together, and that's what we mean by the syncretism. This Greco-Buddhism was kind of a merging of everything that he had seen and learned on his travels. He dies at the age of 33, and nobody's really sure why. They don't know if it was due to him just getting sick or an injury in battle. But after he dies, his empire breaks up into 3 separate regions. We then have the Roman Empire, which begins with the myth of Romulus and Remus, or Romulus and Remus. And if you would take a moment and try and look this myth up and just write a short blurb on what the myth was about. But people say that's how the Roman Empire began. The thing about the Roman Empire is that it was a republic. Citizens had a say in the government originally. And there were the patricians versus the plebeians, and they had a senate. The Roman Empire had been involved in a lot of wars, and eventually Julius Caesar takes over as a dictator. After Julius Caesar, there was Augustus Caesar, and during Augustus Caesar's time, Rome hits a golden age known as the Pax Romana. During this time, engineering blooms, involvement in the Silk Road takes over, and Christianity eventually becomes an official religion. Now, moving over to the America side, there are some empires that were building around the same time period. One was the Mayan Empire. The city-states were located in what was known as Mesoamerica, which was Central America. Some of the achievements of the Mayans was the calendar, and if you guys can remember the big calendar scare in 2012, that the Mayan calendar ended, so it was going to be the end of the world. That was from the Mayan Empire. They also had terrace farming and studied astronomy. There was also a group, the Teotihuacans, which had some of the biggest cities during this time. They were traders with the Mayan. One of their beliefs, though, was human sacrifice. And human sacrifice is actually a theme with most of the American empires. And we'll talk a little bit more about those. Then we have the Mochis, which were in the Andes. So, going over the empires a little bit, there are common attributes of classical empires. They all required advanced bureaucracies, which means they had to have a fairly well-running government. They were all first major trade centers. Okay, so they all developed cities for trading. Food production was key. There was high population. They needed to have enough food to keep the people. Widespread slavery, and they were male-dominated and social hierarchies based on occupation. Now, if we want to do a very, very high-level comparison of empires, something that the Maya and the Gupta had in common was the concept of zero. The Rome and Han empires were the involvement of the Silk Roads. Greeks and Romans both depended on slavery. The Mayans and the Greeks both had city-states, individual functioning city-states. So this particular chart right here is giving you a comparison of the Roman Empire versus the Han Empire. And I would like you to take a moment and to copy this into your notebook, because this would make an excellent comparison essay. So you can take a moment and copy that down. So what caused the collapse of these classical empires? Well, sometimes this overextension of borders, where you're really just becoming too big for your britches. Another problem is internal disruption. So you have a breakdown of authority. You have corruption starting within the government. Economies are falling apart. You may have revolts inside the empire, such as the Yellow Turban Revolt that took place during the Han Empire, where peasants are revolting against the landlord due to high taxes. You could have external invasions, where you start to have rival empires and different nomadic tribes trying to invade. With the classic empires, China comes back after a major collapse. Rome does not. And as far as the decline in the Americas, nobody really knows what caused the decline of some of these groups. Okay, the third concept that we talk about within this time period is dealing with the transregional networks of communication and exchange. The biggest, the most popular, were land-based routes such as the Silk Road. The reason it was called the Silk Road is because of China's monopoly on silk. Silk became very desirable, very expensive, and it was only made in China. The goods traded, as you can see here, from different areas. It's listing the different items that were traded. So I want you to kind of take a moment and write these down as well. And you can see how it was an advantage for everybody to be participating in this trade. And there was technology as well as goods that was traded. Things such as irrigation and the way to irrigate. The Silk Road also helped spread two other things. It helped spread religion and it helps spread disease. And one of the main diseases that we're going to talk about will be the bubonic plague or Black Death, which really started to spread through Europe as a result of the Silk Road. This right here is kind of showing you the trade routes of the Silk Road as well as the Indian Ocean trade route. So we talked about the Silk Road. We also had the trans-Saharan trade routes, which helped link parts of Africa to Europe around the Mediterranean. And some of the most desirable items traded through the trans-Saharan trade routes were things such as gold and salt. Those were two very huge items. And we'll talk about why salt was so popular. Another thing that the trans-Saharan trade route really introduced to everyone was the use of the camel and the fact that you could saddle a camel and that animal could travel across the Sahara much easier than other animals could. Other sea routes that came about was the Mediterranean Sea, the sub-Saharan trade routes, the Bantu specifically, and trade routes through the Black Sea. Now the one area that's really missing in all this trans-regional communication and exchange is the Americas. So why weren't the Americas involved at this particular time? They didn't really have the ability to do the sea travel. Most of their trade took place very close because of geography. North to south travel was very difficult. So usually the American civilizations stayed very close to home and dealt with people that were very close by. Okay, so that kind of sums up our discussion, high-level overview of period 2. We'll be getting into more detail as the week goes by.